What if I told you the most influential invention in human history wasn't a smartphone, a car, or even electricity? It was something far quieter, yet it ignited a revolution that changed everything we know about knowledge, power, and society. Get ready to uncover the untold story of the kid invention that reshaped the world. Hello everyone, and welcome to Go to Sleep Historian. I hope all of you are doing well. This is the place where we let the modern world grow still and drift together through the calm pages of history. Stories told softly, by candlelight, for the dreamers who listen in peace. If you're visiting for the first time, please take a moment to subscribe and join our growing circle of calm travelers through time. If you enjoy tonight's story, kindly like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your words truly mean a lot to us, and your support helps this quiet corner of history continue to grow. Now, let the world outside fade away. Let the night settle gently around you, and allow your thoughts to wander back to a time when words were rare treasures, and the act of writing could change the course of humanity. Tonight's story is called Quiet Inventions, the History of the Printing Press. We'll journey to the 15th century, to the small town of Mainz in Germany, where a humble craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg built a machine of wood, metal, and hope. A creation that would forever alter how ideas were shared and how civilizations would grow. So rest, easy, breathe deeply, and listen as we begin the gentle turning of history as a greatest page, a story written not in thunder, but in ink. A world written by hand, imagine, if you will. A world where every word had to be borne by hand. A world quiet enough to hear the slow rhythm of ink against parchment, where knowledge moved not by storm or shout, but by candlelight and patient craft. It was the Europe of the Middle Ages, when books were so rare that kings might own only a handful, and monasteries guarded them as sacred treasures. In that dim world of scriptoria and sanctuaries, each page was a work of devotion, and each letter a small act of eternity. The historian's voice softens as he begins this tale, inviting his listener to drift backward, to a time before machines and presses, when stories lived only through human touch. In the cold stone rooms of abbeys and cathedrals, monks sat hunched over wide desks, wrapped in robes that smelled faintly of wax and old parchment. The air was thick with the scent of candle smoke and ink, with the gentle scratching of quills forming loops and curves upon the page. Some worked in silence, lips moving faintly as they whispered each word they copied, as though afraid to let meaning escape into the stillness. Others labored through the night, guided only by the glow of a single flame. The scriptoria, those writing rooms of the monasteries, were the heartbeats of medieval learning. They were places where the light of knowledge flickered, small but steady, through centuries of darkness. Within these rooms, sacred texts were copied. The Holy Scriptures, the writings of the Church Fathers, and ancient words of wisdom saved from the crumbling Roman world. There was reverence in every motion. The cutting of quills, the grinding of pigments, the careful ruling of lines upon stretched parchment. Mistakes were scraped away with a small knife, and a sigh might follow, for parchment was costly and time was long. It could take a scribe a year, sometimes more, to complete a single book. The process was as delicate as weaving silk. A single blot of ink could ruin hours of work. Yet, for these quiet craftsmen of the spirit, the act of writing was a form of prayer. To copy holy words was to honor the divine itself, to carry faith from one generation to the next through the elegance of ink and patience. Beyond the monastery walls, the world knew little of such labors. Villages were filled with farmers who could not read their own prayers. Even among nobles, literacy was rare. Books were not for the many, they were for the chosen few. The priests, the scholars, the wealthy patrons who could afford to commission them. A single illuminated manuscript painted with gold leaf, its pages gleaming like morning light, might cost more than a farmer would earn in a lifetime. But even in their scarcity, books carried an enchantment that transcended ownership. When one was read aloud in a hole or cloister, it was as if the words themselves were alive, breathing softly through the candlelit air. Monks believed that to write a book was to build a cathedral of the mind. Each word, a stone, each sentence, an arch, rising patiently toward heaven. The historian passes letting the sound of that world settle, the low murmur of prayer, the whisper of turning pages, the distant toll of a bell marking the hours of work and worship. Outside, rain might fall against leaded windows, soft and slow, while inside the scribe continues his endless task. Day after day, he leans over his desk, eyes weary, hands steady, heart devoted. For him, this is eternity. The steady copying of truth, the endless care of preservation. And yet, beyond the abbey's walls, the world is stirring. Traders cross the Alps with silks and spices. Scholars in Paris and Bologna gather in early universities, craving more books than the monks can ever supply. The slow labor of the scriptoria cannot keep pace with the hunger for learning that spreads quietly through towns and cities. Students borrow precious volumes, copying them by hand at night under flickering lamps. Merchants pay scribes to reproduce poems, romances, and chronicles. Knowledge begins to pull away from the monastery, gently, at first, like a tide beginning to shift. Still, in this first age of writing, there is something almost sacred in slowness. The historian reminds his listener that time itself seemed different in those days. A book could not be rushed. To create it was to measure life by patience and ink. The slow making of letters mirrored the slow movement of thought, a rhythm that bound mind, hand, and spirit together. The historian's tone lowers to a whisper, like a lullaby woven from parchment and history. He tells of the materials the calfskin stretched thin and scraped clean to form the smooth, pale parchment, the ink mixed from oak galls, iron salts, and wine, the red vermilion and blue azurite ground into powder for decoration. He describes the illuminated initials, great curling letters painted in gold and azure. Where dragons slept, vines coiled, and angels peered from between lines of scripture. Each manuscript was a universe in miniature, every detail a testament to faith and imagine, he says softly, a single candle burning beside a scribe as winter winds rattle the shutters. His quill trembles slightly as he writes in principio. Erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. The phrase that opens the Gospel of John also speaks of the world itself, for in those days, the written word was seen as the divine made visible. Each letter seemed to carry a spark of creation, but the historian's voice turns thoughtful now. For all its beauty, this world was fragile, a small, shimmering island of knowledge in a vast sea of forgetfulness. If one library burned, centuries of wisdom could vanish in a night. If one monastery fell, the songs of its scribes could be lost forever. The preservation of knowledge depended upon human endurance, upon tired eyes and patient hands, upon devotion stronger than sleep. And so, as the centuries turned, the world waited unknowingly for a change, a quiet invention that would free words from bondage and give wings to thought. The historian does not yet name it. He lets the silence linger. He speaks, instead of how ideas were like seeds scattered by a careful hand, precious but few, easily lost to wind or rain. And somewhere in the heart of Germany, in the centuries to come, a craftsman would find a way to make those seeds bloom in endless fields. For now, though we linger in the stillness of the old world, the soft rustle of parchment, the smell of ink, the hush of devotion, the listener can almost see the flicker of candles, the halo of light upon a scribe's bent head. There is peace here, in this rhythm of creation. The world turns slowly, as though waiting for morning. And when that morning comes, when the first press clinks, when ink meets metal and paper sings beneath pressure, the world will awaken. But tonight, it still sleeps, dreaming of words yet unbound. The historian's voice fades to a murmur. Before every revolution, there is quiet. Before every great awakening, there is someone working by candlelight. And before the printing press, there were hands, steady, faithful hands, writing the world into being, one patient line at a time. The sound of a page turning lingers in the dark. The listener exhales. The fire settles, and the world of ink and devotion slowly fades, drifting like parchment smoke into dreams. The silence of knowledge. There are moments in history when silence itself seems to have a weight, when the world holds its breath before change, and thought moves in whispers instead of thunder. The centuries before the printing press were such a time. An age when knowledge slept behind monastery walls, when wisdom was precious and rare, and when even the smallest scrap of parchment could feel like a treasure. The historian speaks softly, his tone steady and low, inviting the listener to picture a world where words were not common, but sacred. Most people could not read. A farmer might live and die without ever seeing his own name written. The baker knew his craft, the blacksmith his fire, the priest his Latin prayers, but the written word belonged to the few, not the many. To read was to enter a hidden realm, one guarded by parchment, candlelight, and years of learning. In this quiet age, knowledge was not absent, it was simply slow. Ideas traveled not by storm, but by pilgrimage. A single manuscript might take months to reach another town, carried by a monk or a merchant along muddy roads. Letters between scholars took seasons to arrive. The rhythm of discovery was measured in lifetimes, not years. And yet, the historian reminds us, there was beauty in this slowness. The world still pulsed with wonder. The stars were studied by monks who kept watch from monastery towers. Healers copied, herbals that spoke of roots and remedies, of the humors of the body and the balance of the soul. Architects, guided by old Roman writings, built cathedrals that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. Knowledge flowed like a hidden stream, quiet, winding, often unseen, but always there beneath the surface. Still, the stream could not reach everyone. Most of Budapest people lived in small villages, places where stories were spoken, not written, where memory was the library of the poor. At night, in the glow of a hearth, tales of saints and miracles passed from mouth to mouth. An old woman might know every parable, though she could not read a single word of scripture. In this way, the spoken and the written world coexisted, one humble and human, the other distant and rare. The historian's voice grows soft, like the turning of a page. He describes a scholar's chamber in the 14th century, a narrow room lined with scrolls and codices. The air is thick with dust and candle wax. A single window lets in the gray light of dawn. At the desk sits a man surrounded by silence, his quill poised above parchment. He is translating an ancient text, copying carefully, his hands steady but slow. The world outside changes. Kings rise and fall. Wars come and go, but within this quiet room, time stands still. Knowledge is guarded like flame and wind. This was an age when every idea needed protection. Libraries were locked at night. Books were chained to tables so they could not be stolen. Monasteries kept their finest manuscripts behind iron bars, safe from fire and from greed. Even universities, young and hungry for learning, could not escape the limits of scarcity. Students had to share books, each taking turns to read aloud, as others listened and took notes by hand. One copy meant one lesson, one small step forward in the long march of thought. But within this stillness, something was changing. Beneath the hush of parchment and prayer, the seeds of curiosity began to stir. The historian speaks gently now, his words floating like dust in sunlit air. He tells of travelers returning from the east, with new tales of astronomy from Persia, of medicine from Arabia, of mathematics from faraway India. Translations spread slowly through Europe, first in Latin, then in local tongues. For the first time in centuries, knowledge began to breathe again. Scholars gathered in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. There were lectures filled courtyards with murmuring voices. Students debated the nature of faith, reason, and the universe itself. Each discovery led to another question. Yet for every idea that bloomed, there was still the same old bottleneck, the scarcity of the written page. The thirst for learning was vast, but the well was small. The historian lets a moment of silence fall, a pause that feels almost like prayer. In that silence, he asks his listener to imagine the yearning of those minds, the monk who dreamed of faster ways to copy, the scholar who longed to share his work beyond his lifetime, the merchant who wished to record his accounts without hiring a scribe. There was a quiet pressure building in the heart of Europe, invisible, patient, inevitable, a need for something new. Outside the cloisters, the sound of cities was growing. Bells rang from new clock towers. Markets filled with voices. Merchants carried goods and gossip from Venice to Bruges, from London to Florence. The world was becoming restless, curious, alive. Trade brought not just goods, but ideas, art, philosophy, maps of the heavens, rumors of new lands across the sea. Knowledge was no longer content to whisper. It was beginning to murmur, to hum softly through the veins of society. And yet, the tools of that transformation did not yet exist. A scholar could think, but not easily share. A teacher could write, but not easily multiply his words. A single copy meant a single chance. The historian's tone becomes thoughtful here, reminding us that revolutions often begin not with ambition, but with frustration. The quiet ache of limitation. In the workshops of Europe, artisans were experimenting with new techniques, engraving images onto wood blocks, pressing them onto paper. These early prints, crude and uneven, hinted at what was possible. Picture makers carved saints and symbols into planks of pear wood, covering them with ink and pressing them onto parchment. With each pull of the press, the same image appeared again, imperfect but repeatable. It was not yet printing as we know it, but it was a whisper of what was coming. The historian smiles in his tone, as though he knows the listener is drifting toward the threshold of something extraordinary. Every age, he says softly, carries its own impatience. The Middle Ages were no different. The world was growing tired of waiting for words. He tells of how, in the city of Mainz, a modest town along the Rhine, metalworkers and goldsmiths plied their craft. Among them lived a man named Johannes Gutenberg, a quiet craftsman with a mind full of wonder. The historian does not yet dwell on him, but he lets the name linger like a spark in the dark. Soon, he whispers, hands that once shaped metal into mirrors and jewelry will turn their skill toward shaping words. Soon, silence will find its voice. The candlelight of the story flickers, soft and golden. Outside, the medieval night deepens. In the stillness of the world, the future waits. A future where thoughts will no longer need to travel on horseback. Where one idea can fly from city to city, carried not by memory, but by paper and press. But that time is not yet here. The historian's voice grows calm again, almost like a lullaby. He describes the hush of a monastery library, the cool scent of vellum, the faint creak of wooden shelves. The silence of knowledge, he says, was not emptiness. It was the silence of a seed beneath the soil, patient, unseen, waiting for spring. He pauses. The only sound is the turning of another page, a whisper in the dark. The listener feels the weight of that silence, not heavy, but peaceful. A silence filled with potential. A silence ready to awaken. And so, as the chapter closes, the historian leaves his listener with a final image, a single candle burning beside an open book. Its flames steady against the shadows. Outside, the wind hums softly against stone. Inside, the words rest, quiet, waiting for the press that will one day set them free. Knowledge, the historian murmurs, was never asleep. It was only dreaming of a louder dawn. The world was beginning to stir. The silence that had long held knowledge in its gentle grasp was starting to loosen, like frost melting at dawn. Across Europe, from the cloisters of France to the merchant streets of Florence, the hunger for learning had begun to whisper more loudly. It was not yet the age of presses and paper storms. Not yet, but something invisible had shifted in the hearts of men and women. The old stillness of ink and parchment trembled on the edge of transformation. The historian's voice moves softly, like a slow wind through the corridors of time. He tells of the 14th century, an age of contradictions, where candlelight and curiosity mingled, where plague and progress shared the same streets. Europe was weary from loss, yet restless for rebirth. The great universities had taken root: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca. Each a hive of thought, filled with young minds chasing questions older than empires. Scholars debated the nature of the stars, the measure of the earth, and the laws that governed both man and heaven. And always, beneath their learning, there was a quiet, aching need for more books. In the narrow lanes outside cathedral walls, new guilds of scribes and illuminators worked long into the night. No longer were manuscripts only the labor of monks. Now, lay craftsmen, artisans of the pen, made their living copying legal charters, romances, and university texts. Candlelight flickered behind their shuttered windows as they bent over parchment, repeating the ancient rhythm of quill and ink. The work was slow, but the world was moving faster. Demand pressed upon them like a tide. The historian's tone carries the gentle rhythm of that work. The steady scrape of quill, the faint crackle of a fire. He describes how a single city might employ dozens of scribes, each responsible for one portion of a book. One copied the opening, another the middle, a third the closing chapters. When the pages were gathered together, the result was a single manuscript, patched together from many hands. It was collaboration before the age of machines, a symphony written by candlelight. But even such labor could not satisfy the new appetite. As trade flourished, merchants grew wealthy and curious. Pilgrims returned from faraway lands with stories of strange customs and wondrous machines. Kings sought chronicles of their reigns. Nobles desired romances and tales of chivalry. Lawyers and physicians demanded texts for their crafts. Books had become desirable not only for salvation, but for knowledge, pride, and pleasure. The historian smiles faintly in his telling. He reminds the listener that this desire was the seed of all change. It is longing, a sigh softly, that awakens invention. When the world begins to dream of something new, it does not stop until that dream takes form. He speaks of Italy, where paper, once a rare and foreign thing, had begun to replace parchment. Lighter, cheaper, easier to make. It came from the mills of Fabriano and spread northward through the trade routes. Suddenly, the texture of the world began to change. Letters were written more often. Records were kept more freely. Thought, once bound in vellum, began to breathe upon thin sheets that rustled like leaves in spring. And with paper came woodcuts. The first crude print. Artisans carved images into blocks of wood, brushed them with ink, and pressed them against paper. Simple pictures of saints, prayers, and playing cards appeared by the hundreds. It was still far from the marvel to come, but for the first time, people saw the possibility of multiplying meaning with effort, not patience. The historian's voice deepened slightly, like the tone of an organ beneath a hymn. Imagine, he says, a merchant holding in his hands, not one, but many copies of a single prayer. Imagine a child in a village seeing the same image of a saint that a noble woman sees in her distant castle. Imagine words and pictures beginning to belong to everyone. The idea is still a whisper, but already it hums like a string drawn taut. Meanwhile, across Europe, men of craft, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, engravers, were mastering new arts of metal. In their workshops, they cast letters and seals, coins and mirrors. Among them were dreamers, people who saw not just what their hands made, but what their minds might make next. One of these was a man from Mainz, quiet, persistent, and curious, named Johannes Gutenberg. The historian lingers on his name, speaking it with reverence, as though introducing a character the world has long awaited. Gutenberg was a craftsman's son, skilled in metalwork and mirrors. He lived in a time of both opportunity and risk. His city thrived on trade, yet it was also a place of uncertainty, where guilds guarded secrets and fortunes could turn with a single season. He understood the weight of secrecy, the power of invention, and the cost of both. Little is known of his youth, but legend says he was a man of quiet focus, with eyes that noticed everything. The shape of letters on parchment, the pressure of tools, the way ink clung to metal. He had seen woodblock printing before, and perhaps he wondered, if images can be pressed, why not words? Why must every page be written anew when the same letters repeat endlessly? The historian's voice falls to a whisper, the sound of a candle being trimmed. It was a simple question, and simple questions, he says, are often the beginnings of revolutions. Yet Gutenberg's world was not kind to dreamers. Innovation could be costly. To experiment meant to risk debt, ridicule, even ruin. So he worked quietly, perhaps even secretly. In his workshop, amid the scent of oil and the gleam of metal, he began to shape tiny molds, little letters cast from lead, tin, and antimony, each one crisp, perfect, and reusable. They could be arranged, pressed, and rearranged again. Movable type, a small phrase that would change the fate of knowledge forever. But this moment still lies ahead. The historian pauses, allowing the listener to breathe in the anticipation. We are not yet in the roar of invention. We are still in the hum of possibility. Around Gutenberg, the world continues. Merchants bargain, scholars debate, monks copy, kings wage wars. Yet in the quiet hum of his workshop, the first faint heartbeat of a new age begins. Outside, the Rhine flows, as it always has, silver and slow beneath the moon. The bells of mines toll the owls, marking time as they have for centuries. And yet, time itself feels different now. Something is about to shift, not in battle or in blood, but in ink and thought. The historian's voice grows softer, almost reflective. The world, he says, does not always change with noise. Sometimes it changes with patience, with small, stubborn acts, but go unseen until one morning, everything is different. He invites the listener to imagine standing at the threshold of that change, to feel the stillness before the storm of words. Books are still copied by hand. The quills still scratch. The candles still burn. But somewhere, a craftsman shapes metal letters beneath lamplight, unaware that his work will soon scatter silence itself. The chapter ends in peace, as all stories in the dark should. The historian's tone slows, like a quill lifting from the page. The seeds of change, he whispers, are never loud. They are planted in quiet minds, watered by need, and grown by time. Before the world could speak in printed words, it first had to listen and wait that. The sound fades, the faint echo of a hammer striking metal, the sigh of turning pages, the slow rhythm of history dreaming itself awake. The river city of Mainz lay wrapped in quiet mist. Dawn drifted slowly across its rooftops, touching the cathedral's spire first, then the narrow streets below, where cobblestones glistened with dew. Bakers were kindling their ovens. Bells chimed softly across the water, and somewhere, down a modest lane lined with timbered houses, a single workshop stirred to life. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and iron. Wooden beams creaked faintly in the early chill. At a workbench near the window, Johannes Gutenberg moved carefully among his tools. His hands bore the marks of his craft, the small burns of the forge, the gray dust of metal filings, the faint black smudge of ink that never seemed to wash away. He was not yet a man of fame or fortune. To most, he was simply another craftsman. Clever, secretive, quiet, but beneath that calm exterior, something extraordinary was taking shape. He was building a machine the world had never seen before. A press not for grapes or linen, but for words. The historian's voice flows softly now, guiding the listener into the workshop as if through candlelight. The sounds are gentle, the faint ring of a hammer, the drip of oil, the rustle of paper. Every movement seems deliberate, ritual-like, as though Gutenberg is part monk, part blacksmith, and part dreamer. He begins with the letters. Hundreds of them, cast in metal, each a tiny marvel of precision. Imagine, the historian whispers, a drawer filled with language, every sound of the human voice shaped into cold, shining form. The letters lie neatly arranged in rows, A, B, C, and onward, each perfect, identical, immortal. They could be pressed again and again, never tiring, never changing. Echmorn Gutenberg inspects his type, smoothing rough edges with a small file, testing how ink clings to the surface. He adjusts his molds with the care of a goldsmith shaping a crown. His apprentices watch silently, unsure whether they're helping create a tool or a mystery. To them, it all seems too strange. Letters made of lead, arranged like soldiers on parade, waiting to march across a page. But Gutenberg's vision is clear. For years he has carried it quietly, like an ember hidden from the wind. He has studied wine presses, coin stamps, wood blocks, and the binding of books. Piece by piece, he has gathered ideas, a screw to provide pressure, a frame to hold a type, an ink thick enough to leave its mark without bleeding. The historian's voice lowers to a murmur, rich and deliberate. It was not one invention, but many, a marriage of crafts, of patience and chance. The age of printing was not born in thunder. It was forged here, among tools and whispers. Outside, Mainz bustles. Merchants call from stalls. Church bells mark the hours, but within the workshop, time behaves differently. Hours pass unnoticed. Only the rhythm of work remains: the soft thud of the press, the squeak of the screw, the lift of a damp page, freshly printed. On a rough wooden table lies one such page, still wet with ink. The historian invites the listener to picture it: black letters standing proud upon pale paper, perfect in their alignment. A miracle of repetition, every page the same, every word reborn. Gutenberg studies it in silence. The ink glistens under candlelight, and for a long moment, he simply breathes. As, dan, italiano. The words are no longer bound to the slow, weary hand of a scribe. They can multiply now, like seeds cast upon a field. And yet, his triumph is quiet. No bells ring, no crowds gather. Only the faint creak of the press answers him. He knows his invention will need more money, secrecy, faith. In Mainz, fortunes rise and fall quickly, and news spreads faster than trust. So he guards his secret carefully, revealing it to only a few partners sworn to silence. But secrets have weight. The historian's tone grows thoughtful, like an echo in a vaulted hall. Every great idea, he says, is both a gift and a burden. It demands patience, but also sacrifice. Gutenberg's venture demands both in abundance. He borrows money from investors who do not fully understand what they are funding. He moves his equipment in secrecy, fearing rivals who might steal his design. At night, when the city sleeps, he returns to his bench and begins again, resetting type, adjusting screws, re-inking letters. The hours stretched endlessly, and yet he feels no fatigue. It is as if the machine itself hums with life, urging him onward. Sometimes he thinks of the monks who once spent decades copying a single Bible. He does not mean to erase their devotion, only to multiply their miracle. What once took a lifetime might soon take a season. Knowledge that once belonged to the few could belong to all. He imagines a world where books cross mountains and seas, where a farmer's son might read the same words as a scholar in Paris. The historian's voice softens, wrapping the listener in calm wonder. That, he says, was Gutenberg's quiet faith, not only in God, but in humanity's hunger for understanding. In time, his press grows more refined. The screw turns smoothly, the ink spreads evenly, and pages begin to emerge in steady rhythm. Apprentices hang them to dry from cords stretched across the rafters, like black and white banners of some new order. Each page bears the weight of possibility and the faint scent of oil and creation. Among his earliest works are indulgence slips for the church, small documents easy to print, sold to raise funds. They bring him little glory, but they teach him mastery. With each print, he learns the art of even pressure, the balance of ink and paper, the strength of his type. Slowly, the machine becomes an extension of himself. And then one night, Gutenberg begins his greatest task. Upon his table rests a manuscript unlike any other, the Holy Bible. He knows the risk. It is long, sacred, and costly, but it is also the ultimate test, a book worthy of the new age he hopes to begin. The historian lets silence stretch, a moment of reverence. Imagine, he whispers, the first time sacred words met metal and machine. The first time the story of faith was reborn in ink that could not fade, in letters that could never tire. Weeks become months. The press turns endlessly. Type ease. Recid, ink is stirred. Pages dry in long rows. The scent of the workshop grows rich with effort, part sweat, part oil, part devotion. When the final sheets are bound, Gutenberg holds the result in trembling hands. The letters are sharp and uniform, the margins balanced, the pages clear and beautiful. It is not only a Bible, it is proof that the written word has changed forever. Outside, dawn is breaking once more over Mainz. The river glows faintly beneath the rising sun. The historian's voice slows, as though laying the moment gently to rest. The world did not yet understand what had been born, he says, but in that small workshop, beneath the tolling bells, humanity had taken its first step into an age of endless voices. And so the press rests. The tools are cleaned, the candles extinguished. The city wakes, unaware that its hum will soon echo across continents. The historian speaks his final words softly, like a benediction. In every age, there is one who dares to dream aloud, who turns silence into sound and thought into form. Gutenberg did not shout his vision. He pressed it quietly into paper, and the world has never stopped reading since. The chapter fades to quiet, the slow creak of the press, the sigh of a page turning, the heartbeat of invention still echoing in the dark. The printed world awakens the year was turning, and winter's breath lingered in the narrow streets of Mainz. Frost traced delicate veins along the windows of Gutenberg's workshop. Within, the presses still murmured, slow, rhythmic, steady, like the heartbeat of something newly alive. What began as a single dream in one small room was now stirring across the land. The historian's voice speaks softly, as though standing beside those ancient streets. The press had spoken once, and the world began to listen. At first, few understood what had truly happened. Books appeared in markets and churches, their letters crisp and even their prices astonishingly low compared to hand-copied volumes. A merchant might own one, a monk might study one, a scholar might write upon its margins. Slowly, word spread, not of a man, but of a method. Copies of the Gutenberg Bible traveled quietly from Mainz to Cologne, from Basel to Nuremberg, each a marvel of ink and patience. Those who beheld them felt a strange wonder. The letters were so clean, so identical, that many whispered the work must be divine. Some priests suspected sorcery. Others saw only a miracle of human hands guided by providence. Soon, the secret could no longer be kept. Apprentices who had once labored under Gutenberg carried his craft to new cities. Peter Schaffer, one of his assistants, would later print fine books of his own, blending artistry with faith. In Strasbourg, Bamberg, and Venice, presses began to appear like candles lit from a single flame. Each workshop hummed with the same quiet rhythm: wood and iron, ink and paper, human breath and effort. The historian's tone grows slower now, gentle and measured across Europe. The night of silence gave way to a dawn of words. In Venice, ships loaded with books set sail toward the east and west, bearing ideas instead of spices. In Paris, scholars debated how quickly knowledge might now travel, for a copy once held by a single monastery could be multiplied 100-fold. In Basel, printers inked their presses with trembling hands, knowing they stood at the edge of something vast and new. And yet, it was not thunderous. The change moved like mist, soft, patient, unstoppable. No king commanded it. No army carried it. It crept through markets and schools, through cloisters and taverns, until one day it seemed the world itself was reading. The historian paints the scene in words. Imagine a candlelit study, where a scholar leans over a newly printed page, tracing the letters as though touching eternity. The pages whisper faintly when turned to sound so soft, and yet so full of promise. Outside, the wind rustles through trees, carrying with it the hum of a new age. Books, once copied only for bishops or princes, now rested in the hands of students. Small towns opened schools, eager to teach their youth to read. Priests preached from printed sermons, their words clear and uniform. Maps and pamphlets began to circulate, shrinking the wide world into something one could hold between two hands. The historian's voice grows thoughtful, a little wistful. The press, he says, was a quiet servant with the strength of 1,000 scribes, and through it, the world began to know itself anew. But progress is never without resistance. Some feared that too many books would fill minds with confusion. Others warned that errors, once printed, would spread like disease. The guardians of tradition looked upon the press with unease, for power built upon silence rarely welcomes the noise of new thought. Still, the presses turned. In England, Caxton's workshop, filled with the scent of damp ink and candle wax, bringing the first printed tailies to London's weary eyes. In Spain, printers labored over religious texts and courtly romances. In Italy, scholars of the Renaissance rejoiced, for the ancient words of Greece and Rome were reborn in black ink and bound leather. Through it all, the historians speak softly, as if afraid to wake the past. Each press was a voice, steady and unending. Together, they became a chorus of humankind. And oh, how that chorus grew. The Reformation would soon thunder through Europe on its tide. The ideas of Copernicus, Erasmus, and Luther would find wings made not of parchment, but of type. But for now, in these first decades, it was enough that people read. In small homes, families gathered around a single book, the first they had ever owned. Children traced letters with their fingertips, whispering sounds as though tasting language itself. Villagers shared tailies of saints and kings from pages that looked the same in every hand. Knowledge, once a locked door, began to open. The historian lingers here, letting the quiet image settle like snow. Imagine, he says gently, a world where words were once as precious as gold, now shared as freely as light. Printers worked by lamplight, their presses breathing like living things. They took pride not only in the words they spread, but in the beauty of their craft. The curve of a letter, the flourish of a capital, the balance of each margin. Some adorned their books with woodcut illustrations, giving faces to stories that had only ever lived in imagination. And yet, beneath the artistry, a deeper current flowed, one of connection. The historian's tone warms. The printed word joined people who would never meet. A shepherd in Spain might read the same prayer as a scholar in Florence. A merchant in London might ponder the same discovery as a monk in Prague. The world, for the first time, was learning to think together. And though Gutenberg himself would not live to see the vastness of his gift, his quiet invention continued its pilgrimage, from one workshop to another, from hand to hand, from thought to thought. By the end of the century, presses stood in nearly every great city of Europe. Their rhythmic song filled narrow streets, a soft clatter of type, the turn of a screw, the sigh of pages drying by the fire. It was the music of human curiosity, of a civilization awakening, not with trumpets, but with whispers. The historian's voice slows, wrapping the listener in stillness. The press did not conquer, it invited. It did not command. It offered, and those who listened found themselves changed. Outside the workshop, dawn returns once more. Smoke drifts lazily from chimneys. Somewhere, a printer wipes his inky hands and looks out across his quiet city, unaware that he stands among the architects of a new world. The historian's voice softens to a closing murmur. When knowledge is shared, even softly, the world cannot remain the same. The presses of Europe were its heartbeat slow, steady, eternal. And in every page, turned by candlelight, humanity was learning to see itself, not in silence, but in print. The chapter fades into stillness. The sound of paper rustling, the faint creak of a press, and the calm breath of a world newly awake. Words that moved the world, the presses had been turning for decades now, humming softly through the cities of Europe like a low, steady song. The scent of ink had become familiar, part of the air itself, and yet no one could have foreseen how deeply those printed words would reach, nor how gently they would begin to shift the soul of the world. The historian's voice begins low and unhurried, as though speaking beside a hearth. In the beginning, the press gave us books, but soon it gave us something greater, ideas that could not be contained. The century was growing restless. The church still towered over all, its cathedrals stretching toward heaven, its doctrines unchallenged for centuries. Kings ruled by divine right, and the voices of the learned spoke only from Latin texts. But the printed word, silent and tireless, had begun to whisper differently. It carried questions, quietly but persistently, and questions, once read, cannot be easily silenced. Imagine the candlelit study of a monk in Wittenberg. He bends over a small printed tract, one of many recently copied by a local press. The words are bold, fiery even, written by a scholar named Martin Luther. They speak of faith, grace, and truth, unmediated by wealth or indulgence. The monk reads them twice, perhaps 3 times, and feel something stirring. Not rebellion, not yet, but awakening. The historian's voice slows, drawing out the moment like breath. Once, an idea could die in a monastery before it ever reached a village. Now, it could cross kingdoms in the time it takes for ink to dry. Within months, the same words appeared in Leipzig, in Strasbourg, in Rome. Carried by traders and pilgrims, folded into letters, hidden beneath cloaks. They were copied, reprinted, translated each page like a spark finding new kindling. The Reformation, that vast tide of belief and doubt, had begun not with armies, but with paper. And yet, it was not only religion that shifted. The world of science, too, found itself transformed. In an observatory lit by starlit, a scholar named Copernicus turned the pages of his own printed work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. Its ideas were daring, that the earth itself moved around the sun. Once, such thoughts might have remained hidden in a scholar's drawer, whispered to a few trusted students. But now, printed and bound, they journeyed across Europe. Printers in Basel and Nuremberg inked his words carefully, unsure of their meaning, but aware of their weight. Soon, those pages reached mathematicians, philosophers, and curious minds who lifted their eyes to the heavens with new wonder. The historian's tone carries all now, gentle yet full of reverence. Through the press, the stars themselves began to speak again, and men learned to listen. In Florence, the ideas of Leonardo and Galileo found their way into notebooks and diagrams, etched in lines of perfect ink. In Paris, Descartes pondered how thought itself might be printed and shared. In London, pamphlets spread through taverns, discussing everything from medicine to monarchy. The world had become a conversation, one too vast to be silenced. But not all who read found peace in these new pages. Kings and bishops frowned upon the spreading tide of thought. Some presses were raided, their operators imprisoned. Inquisition fires burned, manuscripts deemed dangerous. And yet, for every book destroyed, 10 more appeared elsewhere, printed in secret, bound under false names, carried by moonlight through border towns. The historian's voice lowers to a near whisper, tender and reflective. Truth, once given wings, rarely forgets how to fly. In taverns, people debated the words of philosophers. In homes, families gathered around printed psalms. In universities, professors passed out sheets for their students. The beginnings of printed lectures, of shared education. Each page, no matter how small, carried the same miracle. That thought could travel farther than the man who conceived it. For the first time, a poor student might hold in his hands the same text that guided the scholars of Paris. A sailor might carry a printed chart showing lands unseen. A poet might publish his verses and find his name known beyond the walls of his city. The historian smiles softly in his tone. The press had not only multiplied words, it had multiplied voices. Everywhere there was movement. The old world, bound by custom and hierarchy, began to loosen. Books crossed borders faster than armies, carrying the promise of something new, that the mind of one person, when written, could speak to the hearts of thousands. In Antwerp, the great printer, Christophe Plantain, oversaw a press that turned day and night, its wheels murmuring like the tides of the sea. His workshop was a cathedral of ink and type, its shelves filled with knowledge in many tongues: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, Dutch, Spanish. Workers moved with careful grace, setting letters into frames, pressing sheets one by one, as though performing a sacred ritual. Outside his window, the bells of the city tolled softly, marking hours not of prayer, but of progress. And though Plantain's presses were loud with industry, the historian reminds us it was still a quiet revolution, carried on the breath of printed pages. Through these presses, the world began to remember itself, its stories, its science, its soul. The past was no longer locked away in monasteries. It was reprinted, reimagined, reborn. Ancient texts of Aristotle, Galen, and Plato found new readers. Maps traced the widening globe. Letters between scientists crossed nations, bearing news of discoveries and dreams. and beneath it all flowed the same steady heartbeat, the hum of the press, turning thought into form. The historian's voice slows toward peace now. Words had always moved men, but never before had they moved so far, so quickly, or so quietly. Across Europe, candle flames flicker beside open books. Eyes move gently along lines of ink. Lips murmuring new ideas. And in every whispered word, the same silent gratitude lingers to the man in Mainz and his humble, holy machine. It was the age, the historian concludes softly, when knowledge learned to walk and humanity followed, step by gentle step. The sound fades to stillness. A turning page, a single breath, and the quiet echo of words that once changed the world. The spreading light, literacy and life, morning rises over Europe like a slow turning page. The chimneys of cities and villages breathe pale smoke into the cool air. In the marketplace, the clatter of carts and the call of merchants mingle with a new, curious sound, the rustle of paper. Somewhere, beneath a wooden awning, a printer sells freshly bound books. A cobbler, his hands still dark with leather dye, pauses to touch one. The historian's voice drifts softly, inviting the listener closer. Once, the written word was the treasure of the few. Now, it began to belong to the many. At first, the change was subtle. A merchant teaching his son to read the prices printed in ledgers, a miller tracing his name upon a scrap of parchment, a baker copying a short prayer from a pamphlet brought by a traveling friar. But these small acts, repeated quietly in homes and shops across the continent, began to weave something new into the fabric of daily life. In the dim light of a cottage, a mother holds a primer, a small booklet printed with simple letters. Her child sits beside her, repeating sounds softly, stumbling over each word with wonder. The candle flickers, the wind hums against the thatch, and the world, for the first time, begins to read itself awake. The historian's tone becomes hushed, reverent. Knowledge no longer sat upon the high shelves of monasteries. It sat by the hearth. It whispered in the market. It lived in the calloused hands of those who tilled and traded. Printing had made words durable, but it was reading that made them alive. Schools began to appear in places where none had stood before. In village churches, in guild halls, even in barns, where children gathered by lantern light, wooden benches, ink-stained fingers, slates scratched with chalk. These became the seeds of a new world. Printers, ever observant, began to see that not all readers were scholars. They printed almanacs, filled with weather signs and farming advice. They made chapbooks, small, inexpensive collections of tales, songs, and proverbs. These humble works spread like wildfire through towns and fairs. They were often worn soft from handling, their pages torn, their corners folded. But they were loved. The historian smiles gently through his tone. Such books may have been crude, but they were a kind of miracle. They brought laughter to long winters, comfort to the weary, and a quiet pride to those who could now say, "I have read this myself." In inns and taverns, travelers read aloud from pamphlets and news sheets, sharing stories of kings, explorers, and inventions. The printed word became the voice of gossip and wonder alike. News that once traveled by rumor now carried ink, a truth that could be held in one's hand. For the first time, a farmer in France could hear of events in Rome. A sailor in Lisbon could read of voyages across unknown seas. The walls between worlds began to thin, replaced by pages and imagination. The historian's voice slows, soft as turning parchment. Each printed page was a small lantern against the dark, and together they made the world glow. But reading did more than inform. It comforted. Monks still copied manuscripts for prayer, but now the Psalms, the Gospels, and devotional works appeared in homes everywhere. People prayed not just in Latin, but in their own tongues. The voice of faith became intimate, spoken in familiar syllables by candlelight. In these pages, men and women found hope and humility. Some even feared that such easy access to holy texts might breed pride. Yet for many, Eat bread peace. Reading became a kind of quiet prayer, an act of stillness in a restless world. The historian lingers on this thought. Perhaps this was the greatest gift of the press. Not only knowledge, but stillness. A reason to sit by the fire, to turn a pace, and to listen. Through printed songbooks, communities began to sing together. Through printed cookbooks, recipes traveled from manna to cottage. Through printed poems, lovers exchanged words once reserved for nobles and courtiers. The press had not just changed how men thought, it had changed how they felt. In every home where a book lay open, a small miracle unfolded, the connection between minds across time. A mason might read the wisdom of a philosopher long dead. A weaver might memorize a psalm written centuries before. The living and the departed met quietly in ink. And so, literacy became a kind of inheritance, passed not by birth, but by patience. Parents taught their children to read as a way of giving them something no coin could buy. Even those who could not yet write their own names might hold a printed charm or prayer close to the heart, believing it carried protection through words alone. The historian's tone turns tender, as though smiling in memory. In 1,000 humble homes, under roofs of wood and straw, the light of letters began to shine. Of course, not all light came softly. In towns and cities, pamphlets began to argue over religion, over politics, over the nature of truth. Sometimes the printed word united. Sometimes it divided. But even in disagreement, it taught people to think, to weigh, to question. Printers learned to adapt. Some specialized in Bibles, others in plays, others in broadsides, covered with songs or scandal. The variety was staggering, and through this flood of ink, the very sound of language began to shift. Words standardized, spellings settled, accents softened. The printed page became the mirror by which nations began to see their own tongue. The historian speaks softly again. Language, once as wild as the wind, found its shape in ink, and through it, the soul of a people found its reflection. By the close of the century, literacy was spreading like dawn across the horizon. Not everyone could read, but everyone knew someone who could. The village schoolmaster, the parish clerk, the young apprentice who read aloud in the tavern. These became bridges between the world of the word and the world of the year, and through them, hope grew. Hope that a man could rise by wit as well as birth. Hope that a woman's voice might one day be heard in print. Hope that the stories of every soul, no matter how small, might find their place in the great book of humankind. The historian pauses here, letting silence linger like candlelight. He speaks at last, almost in a whisper. In the beginning, the press spoke to kings and priests, but before long, it spoke to everyone. To bakers, to farmers, to mothers by the fire. It spoke in lullabies and letters, and in every gentle word, the world remembered how to dream. The age of reason and the printed mind, the historian's voice begins softly, as though in awe. Long after Gutenberg's press first whispered in the night, its echoes began to stir a new kind of dawn. A dawn not of swords or kings, but of thought. It is the 17th century. Across Europe, candles burn later than ever before. In quiet studies and dim garrets, men and women lean over printed pages, eyes bright with wonder. The air smells of paper and ink, and of ideas awakening. In Paris, a philosopher lifts his quill to write about reason. In London, a printer sets the type for a new work on astronomy. In Amsterdam, a merchant's daughter reads of distant worlds and begins to imagine that her own mind, too, might explore them. The historian continues, slow and rhythmic, like the turning of ancient pages. Once, books told men what to think. Now, they began to ask why. The printing press had done more than spread literacy. It had spread possibility. Each printed page carried questions across borders, questions that could no longer be silenced by distance or decree. Scholars began to challenge what they had been taught. If the stars could be charted, could the heavens be understood? If disease could be studied, might suffering be eased? If laws could be reasoned, might justice belong to all? Books became the meeting ground for these daring thoughts. In one volume, Galileo's observations of the sky. In another, Bacon's call for method and proof. In another still, the quiet reflections of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. These words spread like whispers through the night, carried by merchants, students, and travelers. In taverns and universities, in parlors and parlors alike, people debated softly by candlelight. Each mind became a small printing press of its own copying, questioning, refining. The historian smiles through his tone, calm and admiring. Knowledge was no longer a river flowing down from the few. It became a seer, vast, restless, open to all who wished to sail. And so, the age of reason unfurled its sails. The printed word became its wind. Science and philosophy, once cloaked in Latin, began to speak in plain tongues, so that any thinking soul might join the conversation. Books on anatomy, astronomy, mathematics, and botany filled the stalls of cities and towns. A physician could now consult the findings of scholars from other lands. A clockmaker could study diagrams of planetary motion. A curious child could see the drawings of insects, magnified through lenses. The world itself seemed to grow larger and smaller at once, immense in wonder, intimate in knowledge. Yet this new age was not loud. Its revolution was quiet, like paper turning. The historian's voice lowers. No armies marched for this cause. No banners flew. Only ink and patience, and the courage to ask questions. Universities began to change. Once devoted only to theology, they now opened their doors to experiment and inquiry. Laboratories sprouted beside libraries. Microscopes joined the shelves of manuscripts. And within these walls, a new creed emerged, faith in the human mind. But even as the thinkers grew bold, the printers remained their humble allies. They worked by night, setting type for treatises, essays, and journals that carried new discoveries across borders faster than any messenger. Their presses clattered like quiet thunder, spreading a storm of ideas. In small cafes, strangers gathered to read the latest pamphlets. They debated the motion of planets, the rights of man, the nature of light. And though some still whispered prayers to old saints, others began to find holiness in curiosity itself, in the search for truth. The historian pauses, his voice filled with warmth. Reason did not replace wonder. It deepened it. For what is knowledge, if not another kind of faith? Faith that the world may be understood. Among the candlelit pages of the era appeared names that would echo forever. Newton, Locke, Leibniz, Spinoza. Their works were dense, sometimes difficult, yet their ideas slipped into the hearts of poets, artists, and dreamers. From these minds came not only science, but the quiet hope that humanity might improve itself through understanding. The printing press became the bridge between mind and mind, age and age. Through it, a farmer could read about the stars, a sailor could learn of tides, a craftsman could study geometry. The world began to feel connected, woven together by thin threads of type and thought. But with knowledge came change, and with change, unease. Old powers, both sacred and royal, sensed their authority trembling. Books were banned, burned, or bound by law. Printers risked their lives to smuggle forbidden texts across borders, hiding them beneath sacks of grain or within false bindings. And yet, even in hiding, the word lived on. The historian's tone becomes a whisper. You cannot silence a question once it has been asked. You cannot unlearn a truth once it has been read. By the end of the century, the light of reason glowed in every corner of Europe. From observatories to coffee houses, from cathedrals to common rooms, the world hummed with thought, and though superstition lingered, it could no longer reign unchallenged. Printing had not merely multiplied books, it had multiplied minds. Each reader became both student and teacher, both questioner and keeper of wisdom. Humanity was, for the first time, thinking together. The historian breathes a slow, contented sigh. The age of reason was not born in thunder, but in the steady heartbeat of printing presses and the gentle rustle of pages turned by candlelight. He lets the silence rest a moment, then adds softly, and so it was that ink became illumination, and the printed mind began to dream of freedom. The candles flicker low, the presses slow their rhythm. Outside, dawn begins to rise again, pale and thoughtful, as though the heavens themselves are pondering what they have witnessed. Printing the Reformation, faith, fire, and the word the historian's voice begins low and steady, like a church bell heard across a misty valley. In the heart of the 15th century, a quiet storm began to brew, a storm made, not of thunder or steel, but of ink. The world of faith was still vast and gilded. Great cathedrals reached for heaven, their spires shimmering above cobbled towns. Priests spoke in Latin, and their words, like the scriptures they guarded, were meant for few to understand. For most, salvation was something heard, not read. But in the dim light of a German workshop, the press of Johannes Gutenberg had begun its silent labor, printing the first great Bible for all who could hold it. It was a holy act, and yet it also planted the seed of a quiet rebellion. For when words of heaven could be held in human hands, they no longer belonged only to priests. They belonged to all. The historian pauses gently, letting the idea breathe. Once, a man might pray only as he was told. Now, he could read the divine for himself. And so it was that the world began to shift. Not long after, a monk named Martin Luther took up his quill. His heart was troubled, not by doubt in God, but by the noise of men who claimed to speak for him. He wrote his theses, a list of protests against indulgences and corruption, and nailed them to a church door in Wittenberg. In another age, his words would have reached only his neighbors. But now, printers took hold of his pages. They copied, folded, and pressed them until they spread like wind across Germany, across France, across the world. Within weeks, Luther's defiance was known to kings and peasants alike. The historian's stone turns reverent. It was not the hammer on the door that changed the world, but the whisper of ink. Upon paper, pamphlets and sermons poured from the presses. Each one was small, easy to hive, easy to share. Luther's writings, translated into German, found their way into the hands of farmers, merchants, and mothers. For the first time, they read the words of Scripture in their own tongue. The Bible was no longer a mystery wrapped in Latin. It was living truth, plain and human. And yet, not all welcomed this freedom. The church, once unquestioned, grew wary. Bishops ordered the presses seized. Edicts were issued against heresy, but the presses, once born, could not be silenced. Hidden workshops kept working in cellars, in barns, in candlelit corners of cities. Each printer knew the risk. To publish the wrong text was to invite death. And still, they printed. The historian's voice softens into respect. Faith had become a fire, and it was the press that carried its flame across Suro. The Reformation spread. In Switzerland, Zwingli and Calvin spoke of reform. In England, the Bible was printed under Henry's uncertain favor. In the Low Countries, secret presses produced psalms and prayers by night, smuggled beneath loaves of bread or within barrels of wine. Even as wars of religion tore through the land, the printed word kept moving, kept breathing. Soldiers carried pamphlets in their packs. Families read prayers from worn sheets by candlelight. The written word became not only comfort, but courage. Through it all, a quiet miracle unfolded. The birth of literacy through faith. People learned to read not for trade or science, but for the love of God, to understand His Word, to feel closer to the divine. In every village that owned a printed Bible, a kind of light glowed, steady and transforming. The historian speaks again, almost like a lullaby. It began as reform, but it became a reawakening, not only of faith, but of thought. As more people read, they began to question, to reason, to hope. The Reformation did not end at the altar. It spilled into the streets, into schools, into the very rhythm of everyday life. Printing presses became tools of both devotion and defiance. From their pages flowed hymns, sermons, letters, and arguments, some tender, some fierce, all alive. The printing press, once an invention of craft, had become an instrument of conscience. Printers themselves were no longer mere tradesmen. They were guardians of belief, bearers of truth. Some were haunted, others burnet, yet their legacy endured in every prayer book, every psalm, every printed hope that survived. The historian's voice grows quieter, gentler. In the age of the Reformation, the press taught humanity that faith could be both personal and powerful, that truth, once shared, belongs to all who seek it. And so, through fire and fear, through prayer and perseverance, the printed word endured. It crossed rivers and borders, whispering to every soul it touched. Read, think, believe. As the candle burns low, the historian's final words linger like smoke in the still air. Ink and paper had carried more than words. They had carried the human soul from obedience into understanding, from silence into song. The bells of Wittenberg fade into the distance. The presses fall silent for the night, and the listener, drifting toward sleep, feels the soft weight of those pages, pages that once changed heaven and earth, and taught the world to read its own reflection. Printing empires, maps, discovery, and the expanding world the historian's voice returns. Calm as a tide at dusk. Once, the world had ended at the horizon, beyond which lay mystery, monsters, or paradise. But then came an age when men began to print their curiosity. The press, that humble child of ink and patience, now became a compass, guiding explorers, merchants, and dreamers through a world that seemed to grow larger with every voyage. In candlelit workshops, engravers bent low over sheets of copper. With careful hands, they carved lines that would become the new veins of the earth. Coastlines, rivers, mountains. The first printed maps were both science and prayer, each one an attempt to understand the divine geometry of creation. The historian pauses, his tone reverent. Before printing, every map was a single soul's guess. But with the press, the world itself could be shared. In Venice, one of Europe's first great printing cities, presses worked tirelessly to produce atlases for sailors. In Lisbon and Seville, news of distant voyages arrived as printed leaflets. Tales of lands across the sea, of gold and spice, of civilizations unknown. The presses translated wonder into ink. A sailor might never see the holes of scholars, but he could hold their knowledge in his hands. A merchant, once bound to his harbor, could now imagine the shape of oceans he would never sail. And kings, gazing upon printed maps, began to see not just kingdoms, but empires. The historian's voice drifts softly, like a breeze over parchment. The printed map became a mirror for ambition, and the world, once bound by myth, began to unfold. The discoveries of Columbus, Vespucci, Magellan, all spread not only through word of mouth, but through printed reports that stirred the hearts of a continent. News that once took months to cross the sea could now reach 1,000 readers in days. Every voyage seemed to arrive twice, once in reality and once in ink. Soon, presses began to print books of travel and exploration. The travels of Marco Polo, the Cosmographia of Ptolemy reimagined for a new age, the description of the world by Sebastian Munster. These were not merely books, they were windows. People could now see drawings of elephants and pyramids, of jungles and strange stars, all from the safety of their hearth. The historian smiles softly in his tone. Curiosity became comfort. In imagination, at last, had maps. But the power of the press did not stop at wonder. It changed the way nations thought. As maps grew more precise, borders became visible lines that could be claimed, defended, or fought over. Knowledge, once pure, began to serve power. Kings commissioned atlases to mark their glory. Explorers carried printed charts as tools of conquest. Still, even amid ambition, beauty remained. In the hands of scholars like Gerardus Mercator, maps became art curves and colors flowing like rivers of thought. His projection of the world, born in 1569, was not merely useful, it was visionary. And it spread because of the press, carried to ports, palaces, and classrooms. Everywhere, the printed world grew smaller. News from distant lands no longer arrived as a rumor. It arrived as print. Voyages became shared experience. Discoveries, shared pride. The historian leans closer now, voice gentle and knowing. Through printing, humanity did not just explore the earth, it began to understand itself as one. because as explorers crossed seas, so too did words. The Bible was translated into the tongues of new peoples. Dictionaries appeared to record languages newly discovered. The press had become a vessel for connection, carrying ideas farther than any ship could sail. In Nuremberg, a young artist named Albrecht Dürer engraved images of faraway beasts, rhinoceroses, lions, and parrots. From travelers' descriptions, his print spread across Europe, shaping how people imagined lands they would never see. The printed image had joined the printed word in the telling of the world's story, and beneath it all ran the same quiet heartbeat, the rhythm of the press, steady and humble, turning imagination into memory. The historian's tone slows, almost a whisper. Ink began to do what fire and storm could not. It joined continents. It carried wonder. The presses printed not only the tales of kings and explorers, but of ordinary men, sailors, journals, captains, logs, letters from missionaries and merchants. Each page was a thread, weaving the world together in shared curiosity. By the end of the 16th century, Europe's libraries were filled with printed maps and books of travel. Scholars spoke of the globe as if they had held it in their hands. The very shape of the earth had changed, not by movement, but by knowledge. And so, through presses humming beside rivers and under vaulted roofs, the age of discovery became the age of the printed world. The historian's voice fades to a murmur, slow as twilight, from the monk's candle to the sailor's compass, from parchment prayer to a printed globe. The press had carried humanity's gaze, from heaven to horizon. He pauses, and a soft sound fills the air. The rustle of paper, like wind through sails. Empires may rise and fall, he whispers, but the maps remain silent, witnesses to the moment when ink taught us how vast and how connected the world truly was. And so the presses rest again, their wheels cooling in the night air, as the stars above look down upon a planet newly imagined, not by gods, but by the printed dreams of humankind. Revolution in ink, printing, and the birth of new nations. The historian begins with a voice both calm and solemn, the sound of history breathing before change. The world had grown wise from books of faith and discovery, but now it began to dream of freedom. By the 18th century, the printing press had already reshaped minds and mapped the earth. It had carried prayers, maps, and knowledge. Yet now it carried something more dangerous: ideas of liberty in taverns, workshops, and candlelit attics. Pamphlets began to appear, thin, cheap, and fierce. They spoke not of kings or popes, but of people, of their rights, their dignity, their power to think and rule themselves. The historian pauses, letting the silence fill with possibility. It began, as many great changes do, with ink drying quietly on paper. In London and Paris, presses printed treatises by philosophers, Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. Their words flowed across borders and into the hearts of common folk. All men are born free, one said. Power rests in the consent of the governed, wrote another. These were not mere phrases. They were sparks. Printers, once seen as humble craftsmen, had become the unacknowledged engines of revolution. They printed not swords, but thoughts sharper than steel. The historian's tone turns softer, almost mournful. In every age, tyrants fear not the warrior's blade, but the printer's press. And so it was that presses began to hum in places they never had before, in the back rooms of cities, in barns, in secret cellars beneath watchful streets. Each sheet that slid from their frames carried rebellion in its breath. In America, far across the sea, the colonies printed their grievances on broadside sheets. Complaints of taxes, of tyranny, of distant kings. Soon, those sheets became declarations. In 1776, the most daring of them all rolled from the presses of Philadelphia. The Declaration of Independence. The historian's voice warms with awe. It was a single sheet of paper, but upon it, a nation began to breathe. From hand to hand, copy to copy, the word spread. Farmers read it by lantern light. Soldiers tucked it into their coats. Printers in other towns reproduced it with trembling hands, each stroke of type an act of defiance. The revolution had found its ink, and across the ocean, the same story unfolded again, this time in France. The presses of Paris, once filled with royal decrees, now roared with pamphlets and papers crying for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The streets themselves seemed made of words. Tracts pasted on walls, speeches printed overnight, songs and slogans set in bold letters. When the Bastille fell, it was not only stone that broke, it was the silence of centuries. The historian speaks softly now, the tone of reflection mingled with sadness. Every printed word has two faces, one of light, one of fire. The press that teaches can also ignite. Indeed, revolution brought both awakening and ruin. Kings fell, nations rose, and presses worked without rest. In their worry and clatter echoed both hope and warning that knowledge, once freed, cannot be contained, even by those who birthed it. Through it all, the press endured, battered, censored, outlawed, yet unbroken. In every rebellion, there was a printer somewhere, ink-stained and steadfast, setting type by candlelight. The historian's tone grows reverent again. They printed liberty with trembling hands. They risked their lives for the right to read and be heard. And because of them, the very idea of freedom gained a voice. From Boston to Paris, from Warsaw to Caracas, the pattern repeated. Everywhere, the press became the heart of uprising, a heartbeat that pumped courage into crowds, into armies, into the world. Newspapers appeared like morning stars. The Pennsylvania Gazette, the Moniteur Universel, the Times of London. Each carried news not just of battles, but of belief. People no longer waited for messengers. They read the world themselves. The historian smiles faintly in his tone. Ink had once been the servant of kings. Now it had become the herald of the people. But the greatest revolution of all was quiet, the one that happened within minds. For every pamphlet that called for battle, another called for education, reform, reason. The press, even amid chaos, reminded humanity that power should be guided by wisdom. And so, as the fires of revolution cooled, the presses kept printing. They printed constitutions, laws, and newspapers. They printed poems that healed and stories that remembered. From the ashes of revolt, they built new nations, not of stone, but of thought. The historian's voice lowers now. Soft and slow, each revolution began with one printed page. Each page began with one idea, and each idea began, as all things do, in silence, until the press gave it voice. He lets the silence linger, like embers glowing after fire. The age of kings had ended, he continues, and the age of citizens had begun, ink-born, fragile, yet full of promise. The night air seems to hold its breath. Somewhere far away, the faint rhythm of a press still turns the eternal heartbeat of human freedom. And the historian closes his book with a whisper. The printing press did not only make nations, it made humanity aware that it could. The sound of the closing cover fades into stillness, and the listener, lulled by the quiet courage of words, drifts gently into sleep, dreaming of a world built not by might, but by the power of ink. The echoes of enlightenment, newspapers, education, and the everyday mind. The historian begins gently, his tone like candlelight flickering upon old paper. When revolutions ended, a new kind of world began, not one of kings and banners, but of readers and thinkers. The age of ink was no longer one of rebellion, it was one of reflection. By the dawn of the 19th century, presses across Europe and the New World had multiplied beyond imagination. What once printed a few hundred pages a week now produced thousands in a single day. The great engines of type and motion clattered in every city. London, Paris, New York, Vienna, and from their iron mouths came a river of news. But this was no longer the fiery ink of manifestos or declarations. These were the pages of the everyday mind, the humble, comforting routine of the printed world. The historian smiles softly. Before, men rose, for king's decrees. Now, they rose for the morning paper. Each dawn, a new ritual began. Bakers opened their shops, the smell of bread drifting through cobbled streets. Carriages rolled by, leaving behind small, folded sheets upon doorsteps. And within homes grand or modest, someone unfolded those pages and began to read. They read of distant wars and new inventions, of harvests, ships, theater, and scandal. They read editorials that debated the soul of progress, and letters from citizens who dared to disagree. This was the quiet miracle of the Enlightenment, not the grand speeches or glittering salons, but the hum of shared curiosity that filled ordinary lives. In coffee houses, men argued politely over articles. In schools, children learned to read from newspapers instead of sermons. In factories, workers pooled their coins to buy a weekly paper and learn of the world beyond smoke and iron. The historian's tone grows warm. Like memory itself, knowledge had left the libraries of the elite and walked into the kitchens of the common. From this walking knowledge came change, slow, steady, invisible, but certain. The idea that every person, no matter how humble, had the right to know, to learn, to think. Education followed the ink's path. In towns, once too poor for books, schools opened their doors. Teachers held worn newspapers and used them to teach reading, geography, even history. Every headline was a lesson in time. Every printed word, a bridge to understanding. The historian breathes the next line softly, like a blessing. Where the printing press brought revolution, education brought peace. And so began a new kind of enlightenment, not one of philosophers in gilded rooms, but of families by the hearth, reading aloud together. The mother tracing words with her finger, the father explaining faraway lands, the child asking why stars shine and nations change. The world was learning not just facts, but thought itself. By mid-century, newspapers had become mirrors of society. They showed what people valued, feared, and dreamed. Some carried news of invention, of steamships that crossed oceans, of telegraphs that sent messages faster than wind. Others brought art and poetry, serialized stories that carried readers through worlds of romance and wonder. In England, Charles Dickens began to write tailies in weekly parts. Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, and through them, readers found compassion for the poor, awareness of injustice, and hope that kindness could still triumph. The historian smiles again. The printing press had once armed men with reason. Now it armed hearts with empathy. Across the Atlantic, in America's growing towns, the newspaper became a symbol of independence. Every settlement, no matter how small, boasted a press. Farmers, miners, and merchants read of politics and progress by lamplight. The historian muses quietly. Each paper was like a heartbeat, keeping the nation alive with thought. And beyond all these words and pages, something even grander unfolded: the rise of literacy itself. For the first time in history, more people could read than could not. The printed world had become a shared world. A fisherman could read the weather before setting sail. A seamstress could learn of fashions from Paris. A student could discover new planets through sketches from an astronomer across the sea. Never before had humanity felt so connected by quiet knowledge. But even amid this progress, the historian's tone turns pensive. For every truth printed, there was also rumor. For every voice uplifted, another was silenced. The press had grown powerful, and with power came shadows. Governments tried to control it. Censors struck through lines, banned articles, shut presses. Yet the ink, like water, always found a way. Smuggled newspapers crossed borders, rolled inside loaves of bread. Secret presses printed at night, guarded by those who believed that ideas should never sleep. The historian's voice steadies calm, wise, resolute. Truth and freedom have always shared the same page, and both must be read by light. Then, softly, he draws the listener back from history into reflection. The newspaper, the textbook, the printed poem, each was a child of the press. Each a lantern passed from one generation to the next. He pauses, as if watching a line of candles lighting through time. By the 19th century, ink had become the world's gentle heartbeat. It whispered into schools, parliaments, and homes. It shaped dreams, built nations, and gave each person, rich or poor, the power to imagine more. And when night fell, the presses still hummed, their steady rhythm echoing through cities like the sound of distant rain. In their music, one could almost hear the murmur of countless human voices, learning, questioning, growing. The historian closes the tale softly. Once, men believed knowledge came from towers and thrones. But the press proved it. Lived instead in the hands of everyone, and so the world learned to think, not as kings and subjects, but as neighbors, as readers, as souls awake beneath the same sky. The pages fall silent. The ink rests, and in that silence, the listener drifts, comforted by the steady hum of the human mind, ever turning, ever printing, ever dreaming. The silent legacy, how the printed word shaped our modern imagination. The night has come now. The quills are gone, the press is quiet, and yet the world still hums with words. The historian's voice returns, soft as parchment turned beneath a candle's glow. When the last page of history is read, it will not be the ink that endures, but the thought it carried. And so begins the final reflection. Though centuries have passed since Gutenberg's humble press first breathed life into type, its spirit still lingers in every screen, every page, every whispered story. Each time a reader leans close to a book, each time a child turns a page, the ghost of that first press sighs gently through time. In a way, the printing press never truly stopped. It simply changed its skin. The same rhythm that once clattered through wooden gears now pulses through fiber optics and glowing glass. The same hunger for connection that once filled monasteries and marketplaces now fills the vast silence of the digital world. The historian's stone deepens, rich with wonder. There is no dividing line between ink and light, only the same eternal wish. To share, to remember, to understand. He invites us to imagine a quiet room again, not in Mainz or Venice, but in our own time, where a lone reader sits beside a softly humming screen, scrolling through words that travel unseen across oceans. Those words are still printed, only now, upon the fabric of the air. Their source remains unchanged. Curiosity, courage, and the deep need to speak. As centuries unfurl behind us, the printing press becomes not just a machine, but a mirror. It shows us what humanity becomes when it begins to write itself into existence. It made memory immortal, gave the invisible weight, and turned fleeting thoughts into monuments of meaning. Before Gutenberg, a man's ideas vanished with his breath. After him, they could cross centuries, survive fire, famine, even forgetfulness. Through print, the dead could speak to the living, and the living could answer back. Every page became a bridge between souls. The historian pauses, his words almost a lullaby. And so, through print, humankind learned not only how to remember, but how to dream together. The press did not merely spread information. It taught people to imagine worlds beyond their own, to believe in unseen lands, untested truths, unspoken hopes. From printed maps came explorers. From printed equations came scientists. From printed prayers came reformers. And from printed dailies came poets who taught hearts to feel the full weight of being alive. In its silence, the press whispered revolutions of the mind. It turned curiosity into courage, solitude into connection, ignorance into illumination. Every book was a quiet rebellion against the limits of time. And though the centuries changed, the pattern endured. When telegraphs began to hum, when radio spoke, when screens began to glow, they all carried the same inheritance. The wish to communicate, to record, to share. The historian muses softly, like a thought, wandering through the dark. Every message, every post, every printed word is the echo of that first hum of metal and ink. He turns, as if addressing both the past and the present. What began as a whisper in a German workshop has become the pulse of civilization. And yet, it remains quiet. The printing press did not conquer the world with noise or fire. It changed it through stillness, through the patient repetition of letters, the steady turning of wheels, the humble devotion to clarity. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful forces in history make no sound at all. The historian lowers his voice, the rhythm unhurried, like the beating of a distant heart. Every night, somewhere, a reader falls asleep beside a book. Somewhere, a child opens one for the first time. Somewhere, a writer stares at an empty page and dreams of shaping the world with words. And in each of those moments, the press lives again. The printing press is more than history. It is the soul of continuity. It binds together the scribe and the scholar, the monk and the scientist, the poet and the child. It unites past and future in a single, unbroken conversation. As the historian's candle burns low, he offers his final reflection. Not as a scholar, but as a keeper of quiet truths. We are all printed upon by the words we read. They become part of us, soft, unseen, eternal. He imagines, perhaps, the stars above each one, a light, distant yet shining through time, like words written across the heavens. Maybe, he murmurs, the universe itself is a book still being written, every star a letter, every soul a story. The room grows still. The pages are closed. The night has returned. Yet something lingers. The soft hum of connection between listener and storyteller, between centuries and dreams. So sleep now, the historian whispers, and let the words carry you. For the world is made not of stone or empire, but of truth, printed quietly upon the soul. The candle fades to a wisp of smoke. The last echo of the press fades into silence, and in that silence, the listener drifts, peacefully, dreamingly, across the endless page of time. The legacy of words, and now, as the last page turns, and the candlelight softens into shadow, we rest in the echo of all that was written, from the first trembling press of ink on parchment to the endless glow of modern screens. The story of the printing press is the story of us, of voices yearning to be heard, of wisdom shed across time, of dreams, bound not by borders, but by words. Through every page we have traveled, through the monks who whispered prayers into quills, through the hum of Gutenberg's workshop, through revolutions, reforms, and the rise of knowledge, and still, the press hums on, quietly shaping every thought we send into the world. So sleep now, traveler of time. Let your mind wander like ink flowing across an unseen page, for even in silence, you are part of the great story, still being written, the story of words, the story of wonder, the story of how humanity learned to dream in print. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be written softly in ink that never fades.